Hi, in this session, I'd like to talk through the Launchpad for Literacy Skills Framework, which underpins the whole approach. Ultimately, the Launchpad for Literacy Skills Framework is a developmental grid, and within that grid, we unpick all of the skills that are needed for speech, language, and communication. But we also detail those skills that allow children to transition from spoken communication to written communication, those very specific skill steps that will underpin phonic readiness, but will also underpin skills that are involved in reading comprehension and pave the way for higher level skills such as inference and prediction, and the language skills that will also pave for having the base for skills for writing, having ideas, and being able to generate ideas and to turn them into sentences and to be able to hold sentences. So those are all woven into the framework, so that at the bottom we've got the skills that are needed for communication, being able to tune in to people, to respond to voices, to respond to faces, to understand that communication is a two-way process, and those very early skills of beginning to understand and beginning to use words myself, and then building those language skills. So that's all woven in. Alongside those language and those speech and language skills, we've got other skills that are really essential for pre-literacy that are non-speech and language based. And those are visual skills, which are, of course, essential for reading, for phoneme, grapheme correspondence, and also for word level reading and for reading fluency. And we've also got fine motor skills, which are massively important, obviously, for the process of writing. And all of those skills are plotted out into a grid, which makes up the framework. And across the bottom of the grid, those different developmental areas that are essential as building blocks for literacy are detailed across the bottom and are demarcated by different colours. So in a rainbow-like fashion, from left to right, we have auditory skills, receptive language, vocabulary, expressive language skills. We've got phonological awareness. And now that is housed within the bedrock of speech and language, because although we know phonological awareness as being essential for phonic readiness, phonological awareness also has a massive role to play, and its primary purpose is to underpin phonological development, speech sound development. So that's all in there as well. And then to the right of speech, we've got other language-based processes. We've got symbolism and symbolic skills, which will underpin play and creativity and give that language base, not just for play, but later on for writing and for understand the process of reading, and that text can convey meaning. And then we've got pragmatic skills, often known as social communication skills. And when you look at the skill sets within pragmatics, it will read very similar to thinking about personal, social, and emotional development, because a lot about personal, social, and emotional development is actually about social communication, children's ability to communicate, to consider things from another person's point of view. So that's all plotted out there. And although pragmatic skills are essential for group learning, for initiating conversations, for learning to use language, to ask, those pragmatic skills and that ability to put things in myself in another person's shoes will also be really essential for higher level reading comprehension, so that I can think about how characters might feel, or what characters might do next. Or when it comes to writing, I can think about writing in different ways for different audiences and for different purposes, because I've got that ability to project into my audience's shoes and think about what my writing might need to sound like, and what the meaning might need to be for that given audience. So although in the early years that pragmatic column is important for personal, social, and emotional, it's important for considering children's behaviour, it is also in there because it's about plotting that way forwards for those higher level language processes that are involved in higher level reading and writing. So all of those things are about speech and language. And then further to the right, we have visual attention and discrimination, and then visual memory. And up the framework, we look at how children respond, first of all, to faces, and then to objects, and then to pictures of increasing complexity. And then as we move into things like shapes and symbols and numbers, and then eventually letters and words. And personally, I think visual skills are essential, but it's so important to include those in the Launchpad for Literacy Skills Framework, because so often visual skills are things that we assume, and we move children into numbers and letters without, in the early years, actually consciously nudging them through the process of visual development. And very rarely do we consider whether children are visually ready to make that shift into that complex diet of letters and words, so it's massively important that that's in there. And then fine motor obviously is important because it's essential to underpin mark making and then letter formation, and then to be able to have the fine motor base to not just form letters, but to move into writing words and sentences, and to cope with extended writing as I get older. So all of that is plotted across the bottom. So the different skill areas are demarcated by different colours, and within that, certain areas are broken into sub-skill strands. So skill strands is a column of the Launchpad for Literacy Skills Framework, because development is very complex, and within one area there can be many sub-skills that need to be considered, but also to be facilitated as well. And if you hadn't worked out already, the Launchpad for Literacy Skills Framework reads from bottom up. And so right down at the bottom, we have different phases of development. And at the bottom, we have the at first phase of development. So the skill steps are shaded in a slight red tint. And then as we move up the skills framework, we move into another phase of development demarcated by the yellow band, which is systematic preparation. And as we move on from that, we move into the green band, very conveniently known as moving on. And it is about incremental progression within those skill areas and within those skill strands. And it's about understanding that incremental progression of how these skills fit together, but also how they develop over time. Now, as you will notice on the skills framework, there is no age written on. We've got phases of development, because ultimately Launchpad is an inclusive document. It's all about finding out what children can do. And so for that reason, I've made the decision not to write the age band on the framework. However, of course, when it was being plotted out, or of course when you're considering where a child or where a group of children sit on that framework, you have to know about age-related expectations, because that is how you find out whether the children developmentally are where they should be. And also, if you're wanting to use Launchpad for Literacy in order to identify gaps, then you must be able to have that notion of stage versus age comparison. Does the child's stage of development match their age, or is there a mismatch? And that is a process of gap identification. So in an ideal world, children at the age of 3 should be sitting across the bottom of that yellow phase of development, just beginning to move into systematic preparation. And if I'm working in a 2+ provision, then my children, even if there are no gaps there, will be sitting across the middle of that red band, because developmentally that's where they need to be. So as well as gap identification, knowing where children are is about saying, okay, these children are where they need to be, but actually where do I need to move them on to next? So there's that dual application of Launchpad, that diagnostics and that ability to identify gaps. Where in development is that gap? And what can that child do? What do they need to do next in order for me to close that gap? But more generally for children, it's also about having a bit more specific detail about, this is where my children are, where do I need to move them onto? What is the sequence of skills that I need to make sure that I put in place? Going back to the ages though, 3+ across the bottom of the yellow, across the bottom of the systematic preparation. And by the time they're looking at leaving nursery and moving into reception, in an ideal world, and to be ready to hit the ground running, not just with phonics, but with other aspects of literacy as well. I would be ideally liking them to be across the top of that yellow, ready to move into the green. So in an ideal world, a child who would be ready would be able to hear sounds at the beginning of words. They would be able to, in an auditory discrimination task, you know, if I said, oh, in my bag, I've got a p, e, n, then in an ideal world, the child would know that I had a pen in my bag. So another kind of value of the framework is that we talk about children being ready or not ready. So children who are ready would be sitting across the top of that yellow. But we need to also broaden out our kind of perspective about what readiness is. So at the minute, we often judge readiness on auditory skills and phonological skills, which are massively important. But we also need to consider visual readiness, fine motor readiness. We need to consider auditory memory readiness as well. And so it will hopefully support you to kind of work your children towards that point of readiness, and as many children towards that point of readiness as possible, but a broader range of readiness. And when children are not ready, it's a case of saying, right, okay, you're right, they're not ready. But what does that not readiness look like? What does it sound like? Which areas of development is the child ready with? Which areas of the development is the child not ready with? And are they not ready just a little bit? Or do I have to go quite a lot, quite a far way back, quite a long way back through the framework before I find a level of success? And that would be about saying, right, okay, this is where they are. And to get them ready, this is the sequence of skill steps the child needs to go through. So it's about clarifying and quantifying that not readiness, but also making it more specific, and most importantly, helping you and supporting a plan of attack in order to address that with your children. Through reception and into Key Stage 1, obviously, if you're working in England, I would be expecting my children to be moving through the green. But in reality, we know that it's not an ideal world, and that for many of our children, either with all of their skills or with just a few of their skills, their stage of development doesn't match their age. And so ultimately, that stage age comparison is about saying, okay, they're not where they need to be, but how far back do I need to go and to establish that level of success? So ultimately, Launchpad is also about supporting you to move away from that, what the child can't do, to backtrack and say, yes, but they can do this. And it's that ability to find out what they can do, and then that understanding of that incremental structure that will allow you to set next steps for those children and to think about, right, okay, how do I move them on? So Launchpad for Literacy sits alongside the EYFS curriculum. It sits alongside Development Matters. It simply looks at development in much, much more specific detail. So Development Matters as old was about, of course it's about development, but when it came to gap identification, it would tell us that children had low starting points, or that children were not in the age band that they needed to be. But it didn't really tell us developmentally why that was, or what our children needed to do next. Those statements were very broad, and those statements were what I see as end products. So if I've got these skills in place, then you will see me doing this, or you will hear me doing that. And if I'm not doing that, you've got to look at more specific development to actually say, well, with this child, what is the issue and what do we need to do. The new development matters will tell us that children are below or significantly below age-related expectations, which from a data point of view gives us an idea about where our children are and what the starting points are. But from a practical point of view, from a practitioner's point of view, I must understand child development, and just saying that they're below or significantly below doesn't give me practical next steps. So the idea is that increasingly Launchpad can sit alongside that, because if you're coming out at below or significantly below, what I really need to do is say, right, okay, well, where are the gaps in your development? And most importantly, what can you do? Where do I need to build you from? And that's really important, that it's about gap identification, but it's also about embracing success, and it's about clarifying that process of closing the gap. Now, of course, woven into the Launchpad is phonic readiness. So all of the skills that we focus on in phase one are woven into Launchpad. In another session, I'll be talking about what are the skill strands that make up phonic readiness, because when we're looking at Launchpad, phase one is in there, so phonological awareness is in there in the same way as it is in phase one. But within Launchpad, there is a much more specific developmental structure. So how do children go through the process of developing auditory blending skills? How do children go through the process of moving from general rhyme awareness to rhyme detection to rhyme generation? And so hopefully Launchpad alongside phase one can make your provision and make your practice much more incremental, much more differentiated, and have much more of a sense of skill flow as the year goes on and as your children progress. However, in relation to phonic readiness, Launchpad advocates a broader base of skills. So we've already talked about the importance of visual readiness. Do we get our children ready for letters? Because that's massively important. But also including skills such as conceptual understanding and auditory memory. So if I want to ask my children what sounds at the beginning of cat, do my children actually know what the word beginning means? And so we will talk in another session about broadening out our literacy preparation and considering a broader set of skills that make up phonic readiness. And then within Launchpad as well, we've got those speech and language skills, and thinking about supporting those children who have got speech and language needs. And within that, I would hope that it gives you, again, that idea about, well, what is this child's speech and language skills like? Where are the gaps? Is it just with expressive language? Or actually, is what I need to work on their listening and their understanding, their receptive language first? Because that's the biggest barrier, and that's the biggest barrier to learning and to communication and moving on with those skills. So of course, children who have got speech and language needs when needed should also be known to speech and language therapy and other outside agencies if needed. But what I'm wanting Launchpad to do is to also help me to understand speech and language development a lot more and be able to unpick my children in relation to very specific development in relation to speech and language, so that when I do work with outside agencies, I've got more understanding of that process myself, but that actually I can begin to look at where the gaps are, I can begin to set next steps, and most importantly, I can begin to embed those into practice myself. In terms of embedding things into practice, we'll talk about this in more detail in another session. But Launchpad for Literacy is about good practice. It's about targeted practice. It's about quality first teaching. It is very much not a pre-scripted program where I tell you what to teach and I tell you how to teach. Ultimately, Launchpad is about you knowing your children. in that very, very specific developmental way, thinking about where your children are, thinking about what skills you need to build with them, what you need to teach. But then how you deliver Launchpad is about weaving those skills into your practice. So depending on the age of your children, it might be to say, right, okay, well, in my literacy preparation, for example, I want to do some auditory memory work. I want to do some sequential auditory memory work. It's not in phase one, but I now understand that that's massively important for moving children into blending, really, really important for holding stories, holding sentences. So I'm going to do some more activities to build on that skill. Right, okay, in my planning, in my focused groups, what can I do? And ideally, what you'll do is you'll use objects and pictures from your learning environment, things that you've already got, using vocabulary that's related to the children's worlds. You'll use everyday objects and weave that into your planning to build that skill. However, as well as looking at your focus planning, what you might also do is say, right, okay, well, outside or within our child-initiated provision inside, where are the opportunities for me to weave this skill in? What resources do we have that we could use to weave this skill in? In my daily routines, are there any ways I could weave this skill in there? In my interactions, are there any way I could weave this skill into there? So that it is about thinking about your adult-led planning, but it's more about thinking about weaving this skill nuanced-based practice into your pedagogy, into your interactions, into your daily routines, and into your child-initiated learning as well. That's really, really important. And of course, if you've got a group of children who need to have intervention on a certain thing, then you can take those children and you can plan activities based on where they sit on the Launchpad for Literacy Skills Framework. But also, when it comes to interventions, it's really important to embed those. What does that intervention look like outside of that group? What does it look like in my interactions? What does it look like in my child-initiated learning? If I am carrying out interventions that are from packages, so I might be using Nuffield, Nelly as it's often called, or it might be that I'm using I Can Only Talk Boost. I might be using Welcome, I might be using Blast. It's really important to realise that Launchpad for Literacy can sit alongside those intervention programmes. But what Launchpad for Literacy will do is it will help you understand in more detail about where those activities fit into speech and language development, what skill steps are being worked on when we take the children away to deliver this group. And also, what about the children who maybe don't fit into that group? What do they need? And even for those children who do fit into that group, what should their intervention look like when it's embedded? What happens outside of that group? Or what are we going to do with these children when they make progress? Or what are we going to do with these children when that group ends? And that kind of understanding, that thinking about embedding interventions, that thinking about being able to backtrack for children who need something earlier than that group offers, or thinking about what children need if they make progress. So what do they need after that group once they've made progress? That can only come with upskilling you, upskilling your team to understand the process. And most importantly, once you understand the process, how can we build those skills in our environment so that we don't have to withdraw these children? How can we build these skills using objects and vocabulary from the stories that we're sharing or from the objects that we already have, so that although it can sit alongside, the more skilled I become as a leader and the more skilled I become as a practitioner, and the more I'm able to weave this diagnostics into my assessments and also and weave it into my practice, the less need there is possibly to rely on these intervention programs that tell me what to teach and how to teach it. Because the Launchpad for Literacy framework is about the what and the why. Everybody who works with children, knows how to teach. And Launchpad is simply about giving you a little bit more detail about what you might want to teach and when and why you need to prioritise and to do that. So like I say, in another session, we'll look at how it links in with phonic readiness. We'll talk a little bit more about practice, but I just wanted to give you kind of that overview of what the different skills are and the rationale behind it and the ethos of it, really.